Greetings sailors and welcome to my first look at the HMS Hood. And if you have never heard of the Hood and you have no idea what this ship is, then wow, you've been living under quite a rock there. Now I waited until release to actually do this final video, and I'm glad I did, because as with the last ships I covered, what was the last premium I covered? Can't even remember now, but yeah, they made a change between our second version of the preview ship and the actual final release ship, and it was quite a significant change as well in its own way. There was one specific buff. There might have been other changes that don't show up in the client that they also made, but you know, I've asked Wargaming if they could give us a little rundown of any final changes, and just got nothing. But then there's been one or two other things going on with World of Tanks in the last few days, as you may have noticed. But we're not going to talk about YouTube drama here. We are going to talk about the HMS Hood. So it's tier 7, and that's an okay place for it, to be quite honest. I mean, it would have, with its initial stats, with its initial setup, I think it would have been fine more or less as a tier 6, except it would have had way too many hit points for a tier 6. But being at tier 7 does present certain difficulties, and one of the things you'll note with all 3 replays I've got for you is that they are all top tier games. In my experience, the Hood really didn't do that well when it was down tiered, especially when fighting tier 9 ships, and that largely comes down to the guns. And one of the issues the Hood has is that you're pretty much fighting... I mean, in some aspects, it's the same as the Warspite's guns. They are theoretically the more or less same 15-inch guns, but it's more like you're using the Bayern's guns in some regards, because unlike Warspite's legendary Sigma, the Hood's accuracy is very average. I'm almost certain it's got 1.8 Sigma. It's got a very slow shell speed, which, to be fair, the Warspite also shares. The horizontal dispersion seems to also be deeply average, but the worst thing of all is that it has pretty poor penetration. Probably not the worst at this tier, because the Scharnhorst is also at this tier with 11-inch guns, but yeah, one of the big problems I had with this ship is that even when I could manage to hit enemy ships, especially battleships, with that deeply average penetration, it's a struggle to do large amounts of damage. And okay, playing a battleship is a very variable experience to begin with. There's more RNG involved in the battleship guns than, you know, literally any other class of ship, because they are the biggest guns. But even so, it just led to most of the time playing the Hood, or testing the Hood anyway, being a fairly frustrating experience. I can't think of a single game, and I played, I think, about 35, 36. So we're talking around 3 dozen games during the testing period. You know, it's not an insignificant amount of time spent playing this ship. I can't think of a single one where it was just fun. It was just a slog every single time. And honestly, I mean, I don't know if this is because I was expecting something more like the Warspite in terms of its firepower, or if it's just that legendary Hood name led to me having certain expectations. You know, maybe there was a bit of cognitive bias going on with the fact that it's the Hood. But just considered as a premium for a tier 7 battleship, there's no way I can really recommend this over the Scharnhorst, because the Scharnhorst actually feels very similar. Like the guns, like the amount of penetration and the amount of damage you can do with these 15-inch guns compared to the 11-inch guns on the Scharnhorst, honestly doesn't feel that different. And that seems kind of problematic to me. But, you know, you can get there in the end. It just takes a bit of patience and a bit of gritting your teeth. And even though there's a bunch of other things about this ship that make it maybe a little uncomfortable to play, I wouldn't really care if it felt like the guns were a bit more reliable. And maybe making them as good as Warspite's guns would have been a bit too much, but I don't know. I'm hard pressed to recommend this as a ship, to be quite honest. So anyway, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about the stats. And I'm going to do the usual thing, and we'll just walk down my spreadsheet full of numbers and compare it to the other ships that we have at tier 7. So, start off with the hit points. As I've mentioned, it has a lot of them. In fact, it has the most at this tier, and well, that's because it's a big ship, so it displaces quite a lot of weight. And that gives it a grand total of 67,600 hit points, which is, yeah, that's pretty good. You know, you compare that to the Colorado's 50,000. Scharnhorst gets 56, Gneisenau's 58, so 67's good. Is it like the Nagato's the only thing that comes close with 65k. So, you know, you have the ability to take more hits than those other ships. And honestly, when it comes to the survivability overall, you know, the number of hit points you have and the armor scheme, which we will get to towards the end of the video, I have no problems with the Hood whatsoever. I think it's like, it feels armored enough, and if you know anything about the history of the Hood, well, the fact that it's a battle cruiser, one of the ways that they trimmed the weight to make these fast ships was specifically the deck armor. So it's a bit more vulnerable to plunging fire, but it's surprisingly tanky for what you might think a battle cruiser is. So that's all fine. You've got that hit points pool, you've got well, actually, having said it's all fine, you do have the weakest torpedo bulge protection. You've only got 16%, which is the weakest at this tier, and that will be kind of relevant with the maneuverability stats, which we'll get to later on. But yeah, overall, absolutely no complaints in that department. So then we come on to the guns, which is where I have been taking issue. Now, these are 15-inch guns. You've got 4 of them. But as I've said, the accuracy is deeply average, so it's more like playing a Gneisenau, but you've got an extra turret. You know, it's German accuracy and slow shell speed, and that in of itself alone is a bit on the frustrating side, because the low shell speed, you know, with the Warspite, you can live with it because you know when those shells get there, they're going to be relatively accurate for a battleship. In fact, they're going to be very accurate for a battleship. And you've got a whole bunch of downsides to go with that with a Warspite, some of which also apply to the Hood. It's a big, long ship. It's got a lot of superstructure, and so, you know, the joke about the Warspite starting the game practically already on fire goes double for the Hood. You definitely want fire prevention on a captain with this ship. So yeah, the 15-inch guns, the angles on the turrets, I mean, you've got to angle out relatively far to get the front or rear turrets on target, but it's actually, I mean, if you look at the rear angles, it's actually not too bad at all. It's just, there are some battleships especially that you might be facing where you've got that temptation to angle out the rear turrets, but you should resist it, because you will regret it if you do. You'll be showing a bit too much angle, but generally speaking, you know, your belt's good enough that you can angle out against quite a few targets in order to use all your turrets, so that's fine. The reload is 30 seconds, perfectly standard. I mean, for 4 guns, that's fine, or 4 turrets rather, that's fine. The turret rotation, now this is one of the big things they changed between the testing version and release. During testing it was 60 seconds, which would have made it by far the worst of the tier 7 battleships. It's now 36, which puts it on a par with the Gneisenau, so that's a pretty big quality of life improvement, and there are times when that's going to seriously matter, the ability to get your turrets round on a target that's popped up in an unexpected direction. So that was just a straight up unadulterated buff. The range, that also went up, but that was during the testing process, so initially it was 17.6 and they increased it to 18.6. Honestly, that one, like, it would have been fine with 17.6 would have been, like, it still would have been on the low side for tier 7, but it was usable, it was fine, honestly. I'm not entirely sure why they gave it that extra range. And bear in mind, you know, the shells are so slow that firing at particularly things like cruisers at or towards that maximum range, they're going to have a lot of time to dodge. So yeah, you can sail around and fire at 18.6 kilometers, but most of the time you're not going to want to. Because I even had the experience of battleships dodging out of my incoming shells because the shells took so long to get there. Talking of the shells taking so long to get there, well, when we look at the actual shell stats, the 15-inch guns, they give slightly less damage than the German 15 inches, so it's 11.4 versus 11.6 for an AP Citadel. The HE is, however, better at 5,300. You've also got a pretty decent 34% fire chance, which is the same as the Gneisenau, in fact. And that kind of matters because there were times, more often than I thought I would, where I reached for the HE shells, especially versus German battleships. Because otherwise the AP would just do nothing. It would bounce, or it would shatter, or at best you'd get a superstructure pen. Because the penetration values, which the client doesn't show, and I don't have it on the spreadsheet, but the penetration values for these shells are pretty bad. They'd be fairly like lackluster on a tier 6 battleship. So it doesn't have even the penetration that the Warspite seems to have. Now, one thing they did change was the shell arming time. And this was, again, during the testing phase. It went from 0.3 seconds to 0.15. So they cut it in half. And that did improve matters somewhat, especially fighting against other battleships. I was getting more reliable penetration figures against other battleships. But there's a weird thing against cruisers that I've particularly noticed. Basically, I never ever seemed to get a full penetration against a cruiser unless they were angled. Otherwise, it was either an overpen or a citadel. So, if, like a broadside cruiser, you know, you might get lucky and strike them with a couple of citadels, but you might equally get unlucky and it would just be, you know, like 3 or 4 overpens. And this was remarkably consistent even when they made that change to the shell arm time. So I don't know, like this is, it's weird, it's not particularly great at fighting other battleships, although it's better than when we first had it for testing. You'll get lots of rather ineffective feeling penetrations that feel like you're using the Scharnhorst's 11-inch guns rather than far bigger 15-inch guns. And against cruisers, it's either feast or famine with, you know, citadels galore or a whole bunch of overpens. So using these guns feels kind of weird, to be quite honest. And maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just aiming terribly, maybe all the other YouTubers are saying different things, because I must admit I haven't actually watched anybody else's videos on the Hood since the really early preview stuff. So I don't know what people's final opinions are. And it's even, like, this isn't really even a final opinion, because I haven't been able to play it with the buffed turret time, because they don't give us the ships after the release point to actually play with. They only give us the preview versions when they're still works in progress. So then we have the shell speed, which is actually identical to the Warspite. I've double checked this, and it also is by far the worst at tier 7. 731 meters a second coming out of the barrel. So with the Warspite, you know, as I've said, you can kind of live with that because they're fairly accurate shells. Yeah, ships have got longer to dodge out the way, but if they're not dodging out the way, or if you're at closer range or whatever, you know, those shell strikes can be absolutely devastating. And there's just none of that feeling with the Hood's guns. It's like you're playing with the Scharnhorst 11-inch guns, except with a gimped reload. And the shell velocity suddenly becomes much more grating than it is with the Warspite. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure why they didn't just give it an actual penetration buff, even if they weren't going to give it the same Sigma as the Warspite. But it's better than when we first tested it, I'll tell you that. When we first tested it, I mean, I literally went into training rooms with a bunch of static battleships and sailed up to like 5 kilometers away and tested and tested and tested. And there were a couple of battleships where I could get reliable citadels. and mostly lower tier battleships, I have to say. The Iowa was the only high tier battleship where I could get reliable citadels, and of course that's going to change because the Iowa citadel is going to go lower with 6.6, I believe, the next patch. So yeah, fighting against even same tier battleships, citadels are going to be quite rare. I mean, it can happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but just don't expect citadels against other battleships very often, unless they're low tier. And even then, I was struggling against some of the lower tier battleships, firing against the side of a Bayern at quite close range. You know, I was really not doing a lot of damage, all things considered. So these guns are my main point of contention with the Hood as it is. It's just quite frustrating to play. I mean, as it is right now, your best bet is to pick on cruisers and hope to get those citadels. And as I say that, yeah, I knew that was coming. So yeah, if you come to fighting against battleships, sometimes, you know, if they're angling against you, sometimes just go full HE. And you'll actually see that in this replay. I specifically picked out this replay because there's a bunch of German battleships on the enemy team, and once they start angling, you just have to spam the HE. You can't do anything else. And it's the same in the Scharnhorst. You get a broadside battleship to fire at. You're not really expecting citadels, but you might still get some decent damage out of an AP broadside salvo. But the moment they start angling, well, then you switch to the HE and just hope to set fires with that meaty battleship HE fire chance. And it's exactly the same with the Hood. It's basically, in a lot of ways, with its firepower, a Scharnhorst with a worse reload. But, like, actually, I was going to say one more gun. No, it isn't one more gun, because the Scharnhorst's a 3x3 turret. This is 4x2. So the Scharnhorst gets one more gun and a faster reload. Honestly, yeah, buy the Scharnhorst if you want fun, but some people are going to want the Hood regardless. So that's it for the main batteries. The secondaries, again, are kind of disappointing because the Warspite's known for its secondary battery being actually quite nice and relatively effective at its tier. I mean, the good news is they're all HE throwers. You've got a bunch of, I think they're 4-inch guns. I'm not sure. 102mm guns, and you've got a spread of them along the sides, and you can buff them to the same range as the Warspite can get, because the base range is, I think, 5, so you can get them to up to 7 point something. But there's no real point to going with a secondary spec Hood. Like if you've got a secondary spec captain for the Warspite, and I was using my Warspite in this ship, you're not really getting a lot of benefit from those skills, to be quite honest, because the secondary battery isn't really that good, and it is one of the weakest secondary batteries at this tier. I'm struggling to think if I ever got a close quarters with this ship, or would have gotten a close quarters if we got achievements with the previous ships. I don't think I did, but generally speaking, I was very wary about getting close to enemy destroyers because, well, you'll see when we start talking about the turning radius. The Aaa rating, well, this is the only real kind of truly unique point of the Hood as versus any other ship. It's a battleship with defensive AA. And again, this is something that changed rather significantly during the testing phase. Initially, it was standard defensive in that it worked with, I think it worked with all your guns actually. Or was it just the longer range guns and then the short unrotated projectiles? The Hood, by the way, if you're unaware, it had rocket launchers. It had anti-aircraft rocket launchers, and it fired basically little air mines called unrotated projectiles. And they weren't very effective, but the idea was that it would launch these things, they would get up to whatever height, the munition would release a little parachute, and then they'd float down, and there'd be a chance that enemy planes would then fly into them and they'd explode. Yeah, it does sound like one of those kind of wacky back-of-the-napkin ideas that you kind of wonder how it then ever got into practice. And in practice, unsurprisingly, yeah, it wasn't very good. But it's in here, it's on the Hood, and it's now the case that your defensive AA only affects the unrotated projectiles, which have a range of base range of 1.5 kilometers. So if you're triggering your defensive AA the moment they hit your outer envelope, you're basically wasting your time. The bad news with this, of course, is that anybody that's making manual torpedo drops is going to be able to do so outside of that 1.5 kilometers. It really is only going to be effective against dive bombers. And that's a problem because, as I've intimated, this thing does not maneuver well. So it's funny. It's like this weird mix of overpowered and not very powerful at all. Because if somebody sends their planes over, if they don't know, then you can get a pretty crazy amount of DPS out of that ultra short range unrotated projectile AA, which, by the way, does not have a special animation, much to everybody's disappointment. Maybe it will in future, but for now it just looks like standard AA. So yeah, I've had plenty of times when I've been able to wipe, especially lower tier planes with the defensive AA. But if somebody in a Taiho, for instance, comes for you, then it's more or less ineffective. Even things like the Saipan with its tier 9 planes. There was actually a clip in the last battle where the Saipan flew his planes overhead. I triggered defensive, and I think it shot down one plane. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Like, it can be effective if you've got AA skills, particularly. You can get a bit more benefit out of it. And it kind of, like, it depends on enemy players loitering their planes above you for long enough, basically. If people are, like, dive bombers, like, if you come across US carriers in particular, it might actually be quite useful. But against Japanese carriers with a heavier torpedo bomber loadout, it's going to be more of a problem. So yeah, it's a bit funny, the AA. I mean, even just the raw AA rating and the DPS, it's by far the weakest at its tier. It doesn't buff out nearly as well as the Germans. I mean, having said by far the weakest, the Scharnhorst's DPS is actually not that far ahead of it, but it's just got a much stronger suite, and it gets a better benefit of manual AA than this thing does, because it gets the manual AA greatly benefiting its outer envelope, whereas this, it's more that it greatly benefits your inner envelope, your innermost envelope even. So speed, which is undoubtedly this thing's greatest asset. At tier 6, I mean, it would be a real speed demon, only the Dunkirk would come close, but at this tier, actually, the 32 knots is a bit less special. It's equal to the Gneisenau. It's not far off the Scharnhorst, and, well, I mean, the Nagato only gets, like, what, 25? But 25's still not terrible. So, yeah, I mean, the speed was nice, and the speed was, like, one of the defining characteristics of the real-life Hood. But it comes with a penalty, and the penalty is that it's a fast, long ship, and therefore it has a horrible turning radius. It's got a 910 meter turning radius, so we're talking kind of tier 10 battleship levels here. That's, I think, about as bad as the Yamato. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's actually slightly worse than the Yamato, but it's better than the Grosse Kurfürst and the Montana. So 910 meters is pretty terrible. The rudder response at least is pretty respectable. It's probably slightly below average, below in a good way. I mean, this is one of those things where it gets confusing, because I mean below as in the number is below the average number, but that would then make it above average. I've confused myself now. It's better than average. Let's go with that. That would have been, like, if I just said that to begin with, that would have been so much less confusing. So yeah, it has a 13.4 second base rudder shift. This is another of the improvements that they made during the testing process. It was worse than it is now, but no, it's improved by about 2 seconds to get to where it is now. So 13.4 is actually pretty good. In fact, I'm just looking at my numbers. 13.4 is the best. It very slightly beats the Nagato. So you do at least have now a relatively responsive feeling ship, even if it just takes so long to get around to where you want it to go with that 910 meter turning radius. And you can even, of course, put the relevant equipment on, which will get it down to about 10 point something seconds. So it's pretty responsive for a battleship. You can start to turn the moment you perceive a threat. It's then going to take you a while to complete that turn. Lastly, detection, and with the premium camo, with the we'll get to camos because after the stats I've got more stuff to talk about yet with the well, not so much the campaign. I think the campaign's fine, but bundles have reared their ugly head again. 16.2 surface detection with camouflage, which is that's I think actually same as Colorado. Yeah, that's bang on the same as the Colorado. So there we go. That's not bad for its tier, but I mean you're still going to get spotted from relatively far away. I don't think you can get this to be a particularly stealthy ship. I mean it's tier 7, so you don't get the benefit of a concealment module, of course. With the captain's skill, you can get it down to 13.9. So just under 14 kilometers. The Nagato, I mean, for reference, is just over 14. And, of course, the Colorado, I've already said, is exactly the same. So, yeah, it can't be as sneaky as the Germans relatively. But, I mean, none of the Tier 7 battleships are especially sneaky. It's not till you get to Tier 8 that you start being able to stack the concealment module on top and then start being able to get your battleships down to, like, 12 kilometers or less. So, I mean, it's not like it's fine. It's not like the Dunkirk where it actually can matter quite badly that you get spotted from relatively far away and get punished quite heavily for it. I mean, having said that, it's actually got very slightly better than the Dunkirk, better surface spotting. So, again, this is one of those areas where it's not, especially wonderful, but it's fine. It's all stuff you can live with, or at least like the mobility and everything, and the fact that it goes on fire so much, and the lackluster performance of the guns. If it just had the Sigma of the Warspite, I would have been so much happier playing this thing, even with the worst penetration. I mean, I probably honestly could have lived with a worse reload, give it a 32 or a 34 second reload, but the Warspite Sigma, I'd have been fine with that. I'd have been fine with it keeping the 60 second turret rotation time if I got to have the Warspite Sigma, but Wargaming weren't quite willing to go that far, unfortunately. So, having mentioned camo reminded me that I have to talk about bundles and camo a bit, because Wargaming's doing a thing. We've got a campaign going, and that's all fine, and honestly I think it's actually quite a good campaign overall. The campaign rewards are such that, I mean, ultimately you can get yourself a Bismarck or something like 11 million credits if you've already got the Bismarck. There's also 2 unique camos for the Bismarck, because it's a Hunt the Bismarck campaign. It's Operation... Oh, I sort of know how to pronounce this. I think it's Rheinübung or something along those lines. So, that's the whole theme of the campaign, and the Hood obviously ties in with that. And what they've done is, I mean, they did with the Graf Spee on other server regions, but not EU. They basically released the big bundle first, and then they staggered the release of other less expensive bundles later on. They're basically relying on people not having willpower. But it will be sold unbundled at, some stage down the line. So that's fine. I have no problem with that. It's a bit kind of like, okay, but, they're relying on people's poor impulse control and the fact that it's the Hood. Was it the Graf Spee? I can't remember. I'm sure it was. But anyway, so that's not what I particularly take issue with, although it's not something I particularly approve of, but at the end of the day, Wargaming is still giving you the choice of buying this thing unbundled, ultimately. We're not going back to the bad old days of everything must be in a bundle. What is an issue is that the top most expensive bundle, which on EU is, I think, €100, that comes with the actual historical camouflage. And the rest of the versions of the ship that you can buy will come with, I think it's a camouflage that was planned. It was planned to be repainted in but not the camouflage that it actually had while it served, before it sank. And that's the part that's very, very kind of iffy, because on the one hand, I mean, I'm sure the camouflages will have the exact same kind of like bonuses, but on the other hand, this is the hood, and a lot of people will be buying it because it's the hood, and they won't care if it's kind of a bit lackluster. And it kind of feels weird to be like in I don't know if you're aware of everything that's been going on with the Chrysler K and all the drama. I did allude to that at the start, but you know, in World of Tanks, we've been having issues with a lot of premiums that have come out really since the start of this year, particularly, that have been a bit problematic balance-wise. And I'm quite happy that we don't have that issue in warships. But I still would have quite liked the hood to have just been a little bit better, even so. So yeah, that whole idea of we're going to gate the, like, we're going to keep the camo that makes the hood actually look how the hood looked in real life behind this massive paywall. Yeah, I don't know. I can only suggest that people go and mod the ship, that they, you know, someone will mod the skin that the cheaper versions come out with to be like that other skin. And I honestly, you know, if you want to buy the hood, I would actually say, you know, just do that. Just get the mod that makes it look how you want it to look, and don't give Wargaming the extra money, because holding stuff back like that, that's just cheesy. It really is. It's not to be encouraged at all. So there was something else I was going to say there, and I've forgotten what it was now. Maybe it was important? I don't know. Maybe? I've forgotten. I don't know. Maybe I'll slap my head later on and think, oh yeah, I was going to talk about such and such a thing. But anyway, this video, I don't know, it's taken a relatively long time to do in terms of just getting all the bits together and getting my thoughts together on it. And then it came right after the Chrysler video, so I don't know, doing 2 review videos back to back has been a little bit tiring, but anyway. Oh, it's a hard job, YouTube. Oh, it's so hard, you just wouldn't understand. It's so difficult, you guys. So yeah, the hood, I kind of hope it might get some minor buffs in future. I doubt it will ever get as good a Sigma as the Warspite has, but I don't know. I don't think it's a terrible ship. I just think it's a bit on the mediocre side at the moment, and it is purely the gun performance. And it's just the fact that it shouldn't feel like I'm firing the Scharnhorst's guns with a worse reload, because those are 11-inch guns and these are 15-inch guns, for crying out loud. It's just, that's the part that bugs me slightly. It just shouldn't feel that way, and yet it does. But hey, at least when you Citadel, you get a bigger number, right? So this is the last of the 3 replays. I mean, I picked out a couple. I think the best kind of XP I ever managed was maybe kind of 1700 to 1800. The best damage I ever managed was probably in one of these ones. It was around 120k. Probably the 118k or whatever it was in that first game. I never had any kind of spectacular game, and this is one of the reasons why I ended up playing quite so many battles in it. I mean, 35 battles is actually, you know, in the space of however many weeks in one ship is a relatively high number of battles. I didn't go quite as overboard as I did when I did my very first review with the Tirpitz, and I played something like 50 battles just to get, like, you know, the 2 games that I used for that video. But I just kept coming back to it and thinking maybe this next one will be that one game that will really highlight and showcase something that the hood is really good at. But no, just every game was the same slog. Even games when I had a decent amount of damage, it was that same steady, frustrating chipping away at enemy ships. And I just kept thinking, if I wanted this, I would play a Scharnhorst and it would be better. Because I haven't even talked about the fact that I should mention this. One of the disadvantages that the hood has is that it has no way of picking up destroyers or torpedoes. You don't get a catapult with this, and you don't have hydro, and obviously, you know, no radar. So this is one of the big disadvantages for the Hood. It means you have to be a lot more cautious when you know that there is a destroyer around. You have to rely on your teammates to do the spotting for you, because there's just no way of doing it yourself. The very best you can do is take the vigilance skill on your captain, and that's it. That's literally the only thing you can do to improve your situation. You can't pop a fighter or a spotter plane to see if there's a destroyer on the other side of an island, or to maybe give you early warning of torpedoes coming in, for instance. So, for a battleship, that's a pretty big disadvantage. And the Scharnhorst can do that. You know, the Scharnhorst has got better AA, it's got torpedoes, it's probably more survivable overall, it's got a better rate of fire. It feels like the AP is about as effective, even if your citadels are going to do less damage. So, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to recommend, honestly. But I'm well aware that other people doing these previews might have had a very different experience. This was just my experience. The thing is, though, I'm sort of inclined to, like, after 35 battles, it's not just like, oh, I played one game and I didn't like it. You know, by that point, if it's going to be something different than you're hoping it is, then, you know, surely you would have found that different thing by that point, but no. So I don't know. You know, the first thing I'm probably going to do after setting this to render is go and see what everyone else was saying and see if it was anything particularly different from my own opinion. But you know, just chatting about this in the Warships contributor Discord, I kind of got the impression that other people were, at least some of the other contributors were feeling the same way, especially as regards the gun performance. So it's a bit disappointing because it's the Hood, but it's not unplayably bad. It's just, you know, you have to know what you're getting into. You have to expect that you're not going to do that well overall against battleships, and that the performance against cruisers might be a bit wonky. But it's not unplayable. It's just a bit frustrating and a bit vexatious and a bit of a grind. And there are better premiums. But on the other hand, you know, for some people, it's just the fact that it's the Hood will be enough. So I suppose I've hit the point where I've more or less run out of things to say about the Hood itself, and so I can talk a little about this third and last game, which was basically playing kind of like... Standard games are always a bit weird, but in this case we actually were able to, apparently as a team, resist the urge to carousel around and come back and defend our own cap. And it was probably a good thing that we did, because as you can see, we're actually slightly ahead on numbers at this point, but if we had continued round to the enemy cap, I mean, it's harder on this map, and I forget what it's called because there's a relatively short distance between the two caps. It's harder to outright cap, but it is possible. But you know, with a random bunch of teammates, I would rather have not taken the risk, and so I was quite pleased that it wasn't just me turning around to try and defend our cap. It was basically everybody. Well, I say everybody. I think one or two ships tried to go for the enemy cap and got sunk in the process. So I'm keeping a wide berth of anything with destroyers for the reasons I've already stated, and as there's not that many cruisers left to shoot at, and well, it really is the enemy battleships that are closer at this point, those are going to pretty much be my main target. But you know, if I can land some shots on this T-22, that might be quite useful, especially as our Emile Bartin seems to not particularly be going for him. He seems to be heading for the enemy cap. I mean, if you can hit enemy destroyers, I mean, it's still going to be overpens, but I don't know. There's a possibility that the better aim, the better arm time even, might actually help you with the AP shells on this, but I never had any full penetrations. It was just the usual overpens for the most part. So I'm pinging this T-22, thinking maybe we should shoot him. I mean, the Bartan's just ignoring him and getting killed by the Duca d'Aosta at the enemy cap. So that's going to put his ship down. But I do actually manage to get that kill, so that's useful, because he that T-22 there, I mean, he was an annoyance more than a serious threat, but he was an annoyance that we couldn't really ignore. So what's left now is the new mechs and the Gneisenau, and although the new mechs is closer, I mean, with these guns, I'd learned well enough at this point that you go for the broadside ship. I'm trying to think what ships the 15-inch guns would have overmatch capabilities against, but I don't know, it's just I wouldn't rely on the dispersion to hit the fore or aft of a ship except at extremely close ranges. And even then, even when I was doing testing in training rooms, some of the dispersion just made me want to, like, you'll have noticed one or two in one or two of the replays moments when I was just wiggling the mouse in frustration at the dispersion, because you'd get, even against stationary targets in the training room, you'd get, you know, one lot of shells would plop down in front and the other would plop down behind, and it was just so annoying. But against this Scharnhorst, this Gneisenau rather, I am actually getting some rather decent salvos, but it helps that he's relatively close and completely broadside. Against angled German battleships, though, I mean, we saw in the last replay, just HE spam all the way. It's extremely unlikely that you're going to get the deck penetrations when they're angled, and so it's just, you know, get all the fire damage while you can. So he's low health. I might be able to finish him off. There we go. Rather low on health myself. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, and again, another thing I've forgotten, is that the heal got buffed, kind of. It's not as good as the Warspite heal, but what they did do, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, is they made it so it heals more hit points for the same duration, but the overall strength for the number of heals you have isn't, like, the number of hit points you can, it's not like the Warspite heal in that it doesn't increase the number of hit points you can get back overall, is what I'm trying to say. So for each individual heal you can get more hit points back, but it doesn't increase the power of your heal. That's probably the best way of putting it. So although, you know, it's quite nice to be able to get the extra hit points back per heal, you know, you're not getting more overall, but that probably kept me alive once or twice, because this thing, I mean, I said at the start, it starts the game not just with one fire, but, you know, it feels like it's starting the game with practically with multiple fires. It's got such a lot of superstructure that cruisers firing HE and IFHE especially were extremely dangerous. Getting hit by a single cruiser salvo and immediately getting 2 fires set was not an uncommon experience at all. So, you know, you're going to want survivability skills, basically, on this thing. You're going to want anything that can help you not be on fire for quite so long. But at least with fire damage, you can heal the maximum extent of that. So, you know, it's not all terrible. So, we're almost at the end of this. I mean, we won this one on points. The Duca Dosta on the enemy team was able to just run away with that crazy good speed of his. So, rather than make you watch all of the rest of that, we're going to cut to the score screens. So this was, as I said, one of the better ones. Not quite as good as that first game, but still not completely terrible. 101k damage. There probably will be replays popping up as and how people can buy this ship of people doing very, very well damage-wise. You know, I'm sure it's possible. It's just I didn't quite manage to do it. And also bear in mind that it's now got the much faster turret turn time, which does make a difference. So on that basis, I mean, all the games you've seen here are with like a 48, 49 second turret traverse, because I did have Expert Marksman on, because it's my Warspite captain, which has also now been buffed, which is quite nice. Yeah, that, you know, that alone might just make the damage potential a bit better. But it's still, I don't know, it still feels like a ship where it's just a bit kind of, it could be better. It could be better without being overpowered, is I think what I've been trying to get at for most of this replay, or most of this video rather. So for the last thing before I wrap this up, we're going to take a look at the armor layout here in the port using the extended tech tree mod, which lets you see all the normally unviewable stuff. And yeah, the armor, I mean, I was saying earlier on, the armor isn't really so much an issue for this. You know, there were a couple of times I got myself citadeled whilst showing broadsides, but generally speaking, your belt armor is pretty decent. You can see here you've got 305mm belts, the upper belt 127. The deck is not particularly great though. It's what, 50 odd mil on the deck, and then the actual citadel protection is again sort of 50 odd on the edges, and then 38 in that center strip. I can't remember offhand if I had any plunging deck citadels, but it certainly is possible. You do also have a kind of a turtleback thing going on, except it's not really a turtleback as the Germans have it, quite in the same way, I don't think. But yeah, overall, relatively speaking, this is a pretty decently armoured ship. It certainly feels tougher than, say, the Nagato, and it's not quite as tanky in its overall nature as the Germans, but yeah, it's okay. It's just the main reason why you wouldn't want to get in close to fight somebody is more your maneuverability than anything else. So overall, I'm not sure what else there is to say from this point. It is what it is, and maybe it'll be a little bit better in future, but for now I can't really recommend the expensive packages, but if you want to just wait and pick it up for the cost that it'll be unbundled from any and all extra bits and gubbins, then you know, as long as you know what you're getting into, it's fine. You will be able to, you know, make some money with it, train up a British battleship captain, although you probably will want a separate captain than a warspite captain, because it does need some different skills, really. Yeah, it's okay. It's just it's on the wrong side of mediocre slightly, and for the Hood, in my mind, that's a little bit disappointing. So hopefully you found this video useful, and if you have, you can leave any comments below, you can hit the like button, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.